Monsieur le Président, c'est un honneur. Merci beaucoup pour votre présence. Mr. Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, kalispera σας και καλώς ορίσατε. Ladies and gentlemen, on the very ground under pressure some 2,500 years ago, under that pressure, democracy was born. It is difficult, ladies and gentlemen, to imagine a better place than here at the ancient agora of Athens to be discussing democracy, because this is where democracy, as we know it, was born, among buildings that Pericles, that great champion of Athenian democracy, turned into a symbol for Western civilization. That democracy has survived innumerable revolutions, wars, crises, and upheavals, and yet it has persevered and evolved to remain the most just of all systems of government. It is not by chance that it was here in this building that the several countries emerging from under the communist tyranny were welcomed into the European Union 10 years ago. Yet that democracy in Europe is today under pressure, and it is here in Greece, in Athens, that this pressure is felt most acutely. In the cauldron of the economic crisis, of a massive shift of wealth to countries that do not share our allegiance to the rule of law, of a revolution in the distribution of information and many other pressures, liberal democracy is facing a brutal test. The rise of extreme parties to the left and the right are polarizing our society. They're creating mistrust and eroding that essential bond of the demos, the public, and the kratos, the ruling power. So demokratia υποπίεση, democracy under pressure, ladies and gentlemen, is what we have gathered here to discuss today. Some 200 years ago, the Industrial Revolution brought about the evolution of democracy to parliamentary democracy. And this is the basis on which our European nations and many countries around the world operate on now. With our current information revolution, the question surely is, how is it that democracy will evolve now? On the occasion of the 15th anniversary of the sterling partnership we've had with Kathimerini, the International Herald Tribune and Kathimerini, 15 years in which we have joined forces to bring you the global and the local perspectives in news and analysis, we would like to try and provide some answers to that question today through this edition of Global Conversations, a series that the Prime Minister is very familiar with, as he helped us launch it last year in Paris on the occasion of the IHT's 125th anniversary. Prime Minister, we thank you again for honoring us today. Pressure, no doubt, is a word that is all too familiar to you and your office, Prime Minister. So your keynote speech today is most pertinent, and we appreciate it immensely. Thank you. I would like to take this opportunity to thank a few other people, starting with Themis Alafouzos, Alexis Papachelas, and their teams at Kathimerini for the support and faith in the last 15 years. As a matter of fact, the title of this event, Democracy Under Pressure, is the brainchild of the founding editor of Kathimerini English Edition, Nikos Kostandaras. Under his stewardship, we trust that we have been serving the core purpose of the New York Times, our mother company, which is to enhance society by delivering quality news, analysis, and information. In a democracy, this, of course, the role of the press, is a precondition of democracy's success. And today, when it is under pressure, it is our duty to challenge the status quo and stimulate debate. And this is why we have lined up a panel of thought leaders and opinion makers to debate how democracies the world over come under pressure from economic crisis, religious movements, technology, and other forces, and how it may evolve. So I would like to thank in advance all our panelists for joining us, all the way from India to Russia, from Sweden to the Middle East. This diversity attests to our international ethos. And of course, this event would not be possible with the support of our sponsors and supporters, Ernst & Young, Google, Onassis Foundation, and consolidated contractors. Thank you for your support and your vision in supporting this important event, which like most of our events, is organized by Simeon Somokos and his team. So we thank them and Alberto Cano as well. But above all, thank you, the audience, and to all our audiences over the years who are present today, or they're going to be present through live streaming today, and present daily through our newspaper and its digital iterations. Now, it would be remiss for me to not mention that next month, the International Herald Tribune is rebranding. As of mid-October, we will become the International New York Times. This rebrand will be accompanied by investments in new writers and editors, as well as video and online content. So it is an exciting time for us, and we pledge that we will continue to serve you, our audience, by bringing you thoughtful, provoking debate and an international sensibility. We waited until today for this debate because we wanted to align this important topic with the International Day of Democracy of the United Nations. Annika Saville from the United Nations Democracy Fund will speak to us shortly about this, and we are grateful for the support of the United Nations and Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who is present here today through his letter of endorsement. This is a debate, no doubt, of historic proportions, and it is the vision of the Ministry of Tourism, the Ministry of Culture, and the city of Athens that opened this unique building for us. This global conversation takes place in the genesis of debate here at the Agora and the Pnika next door. Whether it's Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, the recent riots in Turkey or Brazil, the alarming news coming out of Syria and Egypt, we can draw parallels with what happened on this ground 2,500 years ago, when the riots during the rule of Pisistratos, and particularly the work of those that followed him, Clisthenes and Pericles, was what laid the foundations of what was to become the golden age of Pericles and made Athens the wonder and the birthplace of democracy. Mr. Mayor, as the current custodian of this great city, you are obviously the perfect person to welcome us here today, to officially welcome us. So thank you for being here, and I invite you to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the global conversation.
Prime Minister, Ministers, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank Herald Tribune and Kathimerini for organizing this major event in our city, Athens. And now please allow me to switch to Greek.
In the last 4 years in Greece, and in particular in our city of Athens, we found ourselves facing the hardest and more dangerous aspect of economic crisis, which is also a crisis of political legitimation. Our political system, what for 4 decades led to stable majorities in our country, is now fragmented. It is a dispersion of political power under conditions of major international changes and reforms. We are talking about a situation that calls upon us as quickly as possible to realize that democracy is not developing, is not flourishing under extreme conditions or conditions of violent confrontation. What And the object of this confrontation, whatever it may be, is through arguments to achieve majority, not to eliminate the political opponent. Many will agree that this crisis of representation had started long before, when our democracy was thinking that it would have prosperity, that prosperity would be there, without, however, looking at its substance, the major challenges and values. So when the economic and financial crisis broke out, we were ready to stick to the content and not to the values. And this is why we left a wide range open for demagogy and populism. Someone might say that these are theoretical statements. I will answer most categorically that these are political statements and positions that may be the center core of a roadmap that will allow us to move away from the present situation. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living, and we lived in Athens, under dramatic conditions very often, suffering from the effects of the crisis. At the same time, however, we are the portal of Europe, which receives movements from all over the world. We have, therefore, to recreate our country based on the same institutions and the same political people which were in power for the last 40 years. This might sound utopian, but it is not, believe me, because I'm not talking about democracy as we have experienced it so far, but for a political process which in reality will not be something new, but simply different. I am referring to the return of democracy in an environment, however, which in the meantime has changed drastically, radically, because we are many now who are living in the period of globalization, and at a quick pace we are going from vertical ranking and networks where the participation of each individual is multidimensional and selective or global, under a name or without a name, collective or individual, diffuse or targeted, typical or atypical. You believe me, we have to realize in this place where we are here today that the most important value of the Athenian Republic of the 5th century BC, the promotion of man as an autonomous entity, is coming back through the internet and technological revolution. Despite all this, however, during these rapid changes, the major values of democracy remain: the protection of equality, of the weak in particular, the protection of individual freedom, allowing each individual to plan and follow his own lifestyle and life plan, tolerance towards diversity, the strong but peaceful political confrontation, transparency, which allows citizens to take civic action, and many other things have to be rediscovered. Others have to be sought again because we lost them on the way. Having all this in mind, we undertook from the beginning of our mandate a huge reform project in the municipality of Athens, a project which is not limited to consolidation, but consists of an important proposal for the revival of this historic great city, which now has many wounds: economic consolidation, use of the internet, social policy for supporting poor people, homeless people, transparency in the operation of the municipality and its contacts with citizens. In a period of less than 3 years, we have set the basis for a new municipality, and we are already seeing the results of all these efforts. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in a country from which certainties have disappeared, and the questions that arise are more than the answers that are available. Answers to all these questions raised by civil society, the people who are excluded from society, and the citizens of Europe. To these problems, we are trying to bring answers through a tangible example of how you can use democracy and the democratic process in difficult conditions. The answer of Athens will be look for consent, for ways of solving major problems, cooperating with political powers that believe in reforms and also believe in democracy, however, because violence cannot be removed with wishful thinking, but with actions and political actions and daring policies. Thank you very much.
Efaristo. Distinguished guests, excellencies, generous hosts, Kalispera. I'm Annika Saville of the UN Democracy Fund. Happy International Day of Democracy to you all. Today, there was a peaceful demonstration outside my window opposite Parliament. Yet another reason why this day takes on special meaning in Athens, and why the UN Democracy Fund, UNDEF, is honored to be a partner in this event. My organization feels a sense of belonging in the heart of the ancient agora. You could even say it's where the UN Democracy Fund was born, or at least where we were issued our birth certificate. Ladies and gentlemen, inserted in your programs is a personal message to you all from UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Let me quote briefly from it. Your meeting place in the Agora of Athens, the birthplace of democracy, reminds us that the practice of democracy is not a spectator sport, and that it is more like a marathon than a sprint. End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, those words can seem about as exciting as it gets when the UN speaks on the issue of democracy. But when you think about it, the fact that the UN explicitly addresses democracy at all is in itself an achievement. The word democracy, in fact, appears nowhere in the UN Charter. As for the UN Security Council, some have argued that its very structure may not conform to basic democratic principles. On the other hand, some cynics would say the UN General Assembly is too democratic for its own good. Above all, several UN member states quite openly do not subscribe to democratic values. And yet more go through the motions of democracy but have no intention of putting it into living practice for all its citizens. And that is why the UN Democracy Fund is such an interesting proposition. It's the only UN entity whose name contains the word democracy. More important, it works directly with local, non-governmental actors to support democracy projects on the ground. In this way, it complements the more traditional work of the UN, the work with states, to advance good governance around the world. In other words, UNDEF supports the demand side of democracy rather than the supply side. In the 7 short years since it was created, UNDEF has funded more than 400 projects in over 100 countries. These range from training women in democratic leadership to strengthening access to justice, from fostering greater transparency in procurement to running boot camps for social media training, from supporting migrant workers' rights to fostering dialogue between indigenous people and extractive industry. None of this comes from the UN's regular budget. All of it is funded by voluntary contributions from UN member states who embrace the democratic ideal. Almost half are non-traditional donors in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, from Senegal to Iraq to Mongolia to Peru. Tonight, it is a special honor to have with us ministers from 2 of UNDEF's top contributors, India, the world's largest democracy, and Sweden, one of the world's most entrenched. That both ministers also have a past as distinguished servants of the UN brings the whole logic full circle. I'm grateful to the International Herald Tribune and all our eminent panelists for the lively debate that lies ahead tonight. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, let me take a safe and neutral back seat and let others do the talking. Thank you very much.
Mr. Prime Minister, Monsieur le Président, Mr. Mayor, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Roger Cohen. I'm a columnist for the New York Times and the International Herald Tribune. It's always a great pleasure to be back in Greece among the cypress and the pine trees in the palpable presence of this extraordinary civilization. There may be a Greek crisis, but nothing will ever take away Greek beauty. Well, here we are in the home of democracy, the worst form of government, as Churchill noted, except for all others that have been tried from time to time. It's been a particularly rough passage of late for the democratic idea. From Cairo to Athens, by way of Ankara, democracy is under pressure, or worse. Markets are intolerant of democratic dithering. Political elites are the targets of anger. Acute economic difficulty feeds the politics of anti-democratic hatred. Gridlock is evident from Washington to Brussels. Alternative models, Chinese or Russian, are often invoked. Democracy, people complain, is just not delivering. We claim to be citizens, not statistics, read a banner I saw at a demonstration here in Athens today. Anger is understandable, but nobody, to my knowledge, has come up with any other model that guarantees the freedom the human spirit craves, nor the rule of law that human nature demands. Well, is any alternative model viable? What does democracy need to be reinforced? How must democracy change in the age of social media? Is democracy indeed indispensable for liberty? Socratic questions all, and here today to reflect on democracy in its home, we have two of the most eminent representatives of democracy and two of its most ardent advocates, President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing of France and Prime Minister Antonis Samaras. Monsieur le Président, voudriez-vous dire peut-être quelques mots? Un mot, peut-être? Oui?
Écoutez, je suis pris par surprise. I will try to speak in English, and later on, with Mr. Prime Minister, I will try to speak in Greek. I'm taken by surprise by Mr. Cohen. Anyway, it is legitimate, because I am a very old reader of the New York Herald Tribune for years. And if you don't believe me, you can check it, because I am also a subscriber. And to speak of democracy here, it's at the same time natural and moving. We must try to re-understand, in a few words, what happened here. It was a small community, in fact. The citizens of Greece, because they were people, but they are citizens also, of that period were 6,000, 7,000 here. They were under tyranny. They were governed by despots, by dictators. And they decided to change it. They made it through a process, because their first demand in the year 480 BC was not for power, it was for speaking. The birth of democracy is a demand for speaking. And after a while, it changed, was structured, and became a demand for sharing of power. It is not, Mr. Cohen, a demand by individual. It's a demand by the group. It's named democracy, which means power of the group, not power of the individual. And now democracy looks a little bit like monocracy, that is done for the persons. It was to find what was good for the group. And the main decisions of the 5th century before were decisions about war. War with the Persian, war with Peloponnese people, Spartan people, and they were submitted to vote. And the vote was not to say what is good for me, it was to say what is good for Athens. So we must remember this lesson, I think, and always put into the democratic move the spirit that at the end it's a way to serve the group and not to serve oneself. And for Greece now, Mr. Prime Minister, who worked with dedication and ability to go through the difficult Greek problems of this time, you do it in a democratic way. And I hope you will be rewarded in a democratic answer. Democracy was born here. It is a goddess, more or less. I wish that this goddess helps Greece, under your leadership, to find the best and the most European solution for its problems. Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Mr. President, on behalf of the Greek people, we greatly appreciate your words from a true democratic leader and a true friend of Greece, maybe the most true friend of Greece in Greek modern times. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mayor, dear friends, democracy under pressure is a challenging topic, taking place in a challenging country at a very challenging historical moment indeed. Democracy as a word was coined in the classical tradition of this city of Athens. And democracy was established, as the President said, as the rule of the people, in the name of the people, by the people, and also by the law, as opposed to tyranny. Democracy is not just a fixed set of governing rules. It is alive. It deals with all kinds of internal pressures. It opens up, as the President said, a public discussion and comes up with majority decisions, binding for all, as well as elected representatives to implement those decisions. Therefore, democracy produces its own legitimacy as everybody accepts in advance any decision to be taken by public consent. Democracy is the framework within which different views and groups resolve their differences peacefully, preserving the unity of the society, cooperation among themselves, and prosperity for all. Within the democratic rule of law, society is not fragmented by different groups, nor is it kept together by coercion, by force. Societies do not have to sacrifice their unity to protect their freedom, or sacrifice their freedom to protect their unity. Freedom and security are simultaneously guaranteed in the context of a democratic rule of law. Normally, therefore, democracy lives in pressure, deals with pressure, and turns internal pressures to civil unity, to social progress, and economic prosperity. But as it happens with all living organisms, there are cases when too much pressure is simply not easy to handle. This is the case when deep economic crisis, deep social crisis, or foreign threats turn public discussion into a chaotic polarization instead of a compromise accepted by all. When extensive disillusion generates public discontent instead of democratic legitimacy. This is the case when hope is lost for the many, when common ideals lose their appeal to the public, and common perspectives lose their legitimacy. In these challenging moments, democracy breeds its own enemism, which is basically extremism. Extremism polarizes society, preventing any democratic compromise. It undermines its unity and its freedom simultaneously. It undermines public order and the rule of law. Both extremity and populism talk in the name of the people only to destroy public interest. They both talk in the name of the nation only to the detriment of national interest. They both talk in the name of society as a whole, only to subjugate society to all kinds of tyrants, usually presented as saviors. It has happened so many times in antiquity, in Athens and in Rome, ending up in the demise of society and of democracy. It has happened so many times in our modern times, in post-revolutionary France and in the German Republic of the Weimar. But it is not the inescapable fate of democracy to fall victim of populism and extremism. We have the opposite example of the United States under Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 30s, of France under General de Gaulle in the 50s, of modern Greece under Eleftherios Venizelos in early 20th century, and also of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing's friend, Konstantinos Karamanlis in Greece in the 70s. In all these cases, severe social crises did not end up with the demise of democracy. Instead, they were transformed to new democratic regimes, more socially just, more growth-oriented, more inspiring for the people, protecting and restoring the dignity of the country as a whole. In all these cases, democracy found itself under severe pressure, but it managed to survive because it restored hope to the people. And then it restored public order. And then it restored common prospects for all, dignity to the society, and a sense of unity for the nation. How did democracy accomplish all those miracles? I believe through sweeping reforms. What kind of reforms? By providing opportunities to all. Because there's no individual freedom and dignity when people are deprived of opportunities to better their lives. But reforms take some time to be implemented. And even after their implementation, they usually take some time before they can bring tangible results, results beneficial to all. In the meantime, people have to believe in them. So the first thing of paramount importance in times of crisis is, I believe, public perception. People have to believe in a better life before they can achieve one. Democracies under pressure have to change the public perceptions before they can change the actual terms of life for the people. In other words, they must first restore hope. And there can only be hope if there is self-esteem. In other words, people can believe in the future only if they believe in themselves, individually and collectively. This is why extremism tries to break society's morale, tries to make people lose faith in their future and in themselves. If people retain their self-confidence and their dignity, they will never accept tyrants as saviors. So hope and self-confidence are necessary requirements of public discourse for a democracy to survive under pressure. Lastly, democracy should always fight against extremism. And populism destroys public discourse. Extremism destroys social unity. And often it is difficult to discern populism from extremism. They normally generate each other and feed on each other. Sometimes populism penetrates easier into legitimate political parties, and it then degenerates into extremism. And then extremism of one of a kind generates extremism of the opposite kind. Soon enough, society is polarized between different extremisms, with all moderate forces getting squeezed in the middle. This is a nightmare scenario for any democracy. This is why populism has to be resisted in every step of the way, and extremism has to be confronted in all different shapes and forms. You cannot restore people's belief in democracy and in themselves unless moderate forces prevail on extremism. The problem is that when you are fighting against it, you're not fighting with reasonable arguments. You are fighting with conspiracy theories and perverse perceptions. And when you are fighting against extremism, you're not dealing with people's rationale. You are dealing with deep-rooted fears. The only way to change wrong perceptions is to lead by example. When you're asking people to make necessary sacrifices, you must be the first to make sacrifices. When you ask people to work harder, make sure that you yourself work harder. When the prevailing perception is that no big shot is ever brought to justice, make sure that many big shots are brought to justice. When the public perception is that nothing can really change, make sure that you implement changes everybody looked for, but nobody had thought as possible so far. And also, when people are in pain, make sure you feel their pain. Populists try to capitalize on their pain. Extremists try to exacerbate their pain. You have to make sure everybody understands that you feel their pain. You are trying to relieve it and to ameliorate it. At every moment, people have to know the truth. Give it to them undisguised, but also make sure that you give them some hope, some realistic hope, tangible hope, to ensure that hardships and believe that there is some light at the end of the tunnel. Populists and extremists will try to make people desperate. This is exactly what we now experience in Greece. Democracy has to make sure that people remain hopeful. For some time, people will not know what to believe in. You have to insist on two things: truth and hope. You can only win people's confidence eventually if you keep telling them the truth and justify their hopes. So what is the recipe for a successful democratic response during those times of extreme pressure? Sweeping reforms, constant fight against extremism and populism of all kinds, rule by example, show compassion, change the perverse stereotypes and perceptions, fight deep-rooted fears with truth and with hope. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, during the last 4 years, my country here in Greece has been going through an unprecedented crisis in times of peace. We are going through the 6th year, Mr. President, of a recession, during which we have lost about 25% of our GDP. This is truly unprecedented since the days of the Great Recession, Depression in the 30s. We are currently having a record unemployment of almost 28% for the overall population and more than 60% for our youth under 25 years of age. So if you want to find something about democracy under pressure, you know where to look today. On the other hand, Greece is not only unique in its hardships, it has also managed some remarkable achievements as well. We have accomplished about 3/4 of our gigantic fiscal adjustment of about 15% of our current GDP in just 4 years. We are achieving a primary surplus, hopefully by the end of this year. And if you disregard our deep and prolonged recession, we are running the largest cyclically adjusted primary surplus in Europe, as well as the largest structural surplus. With the help of our European partners, we have achieved the largest debt reduction and the most extensive debt restructuring ever. We have lowered our interest rates to 1/2 compared to the start of the crisis, and our interest payments to 1/3. Within a year, we managed to bring our program on track, and we also managed to change radically the image of our country worldwide. A year ago, many abroad were talking openly about Brexit, about a prospective exit of Greece from the euro. Now everybody talks about recovery. In other words, everybody expects a recovery in Greece as early as next year. To put it differently, last year we were the weak link of the European Union, the basic source of uncertainty about Europe's future and the future of the common currency. Now there's no uncertainty about the euro anymore, and Greece is no longer perceived as the weak link in Europe. Quite the opposite, if you are to take into account what is happening in our region, in the Eastern Mediterranean. We are now rather perceived as a stronghold to stability and security, and we intend to improve on that also. We're not out of the woods yet. There are too many problems we have to deal with, ladies and gentlemen. But in the last 14 months, we've changed the image of our country abroad, we stabilized our country internally, we have implemented sweeping reforms, we have brought our program back on track with no compromises as to the extent of our fiscal adjustment and our structural reforms. There's no question that there were serious mistakes at the first stage of our program. There's no question that austerity alone cannot bring about adjustment effectively. One also needs growth supporting and growth enhancing, balancing measures. But now we have put all that in the past, we corrected what could be corrected, and now we are going through the end of the recession. Once growth starts and people feel its benefits, we will move out of the crisis altogether. According to most, we will not need a couple of decades, not a couple of generations, but only 6 years to get back at the pre-crisis levels of our standard of living and our GDP. So recovery is ante portas. Long-term sustainable growth will soon become our official exit from the crisis. These are good news for Greece, but they're also good news for the European Union, because despite everything, all the hardships and some bitter words exchanged in the process, Greece's example will eventually stand as a European success, whether some like it or not like it. But this is no time to relax. There is a blind spot in all this effort, a blind spot, which is the critical time after the actual turn of the economy and before the improvement is felt by the large part of our society. This will be the last chance for populism and extremism to try to derail the whole process. And they will do, believe me, everything possible to undermine any achievement of this country. This is what makes these next few months crucial. They're not the most difficult, but they're the most politically sensitive. We believe in our people. We believe in the vast potential of this country. We believe in the potential of the united Europe. We came thus far, and we know we can make it to the end. Democracy can defeat its enemies based on truth, hope, and growth. These are the powerful antibodies against extremism and populism. Democracy can make it eventually, even under extreme pressure. Democracy can come out stronger and better under pressure. I'm confident this will be the lesson learned from Greece in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister, for that powerful and moving speech about Greece's dilemmas and the future of democracy and how democracy will prevail here. And now I'd like to ask Alexis Papahelas, the executive editor of Kathimerini, and the other panelists to please come up on the stage. Thank you.
Inside? Yes.
Sorry? Wait until everybody gets back. Should we wait for the people to come back or no? Should we wait for the rest to come back or no? Okay.
And how do you want to do this? These opening remarks, we deliver them from there, and then Jan comes.
No, we all sit here.
Just have a conversation.
We'll do a couple of remarks in the beginning, then we'll have a conversation among ourselves, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
If these opening remarks then also part of the conversation here? We don't need to go to the lecture.
Yeah.
I think we should ask people to take a seat.
If you could please sit down so we can continue with the program. Αν έχετε καλοσύνη να καθίσετε για να συνεχίσουμε τη...
Take your seats so that we can go on with our program.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. If you could have a seat, it would be really wonderful so we can proceed with the program. And now we come to the truly global part of this conversation. We have a very distinguished panel here with us that spans the world, basically. Next to me is Carl Bildt, Foreign Minister of Sweden, well known around the world for being part of various conspiracies and brainstormings. We also have Masha Green, a journalist and writer. She has spent a lot of time in Russia, on Russia.
My last name is Gessen.
Sorry?
Gessen, not Green.
Okay, yeah. Then we also have Slashi Taru, who is he's an MP, and he's also a Minister of State for Human Development in India. He's a very well-known personality in India. We have Sultan Al-Qasemi, who's an Arab commentator. He has written on various Middle Eastern outlets on the Arab Spring, on democracy. And of course, Roger Cohen, who is a true globalist by definition. And I asked Roger, if we could co-moderate this panel. As you all know, the subject today is democracy under pressure. The way it's going to work in terms of the process is everybody will make some informal remarks in the beginning for 3 or 4 minutes. Then we'll engage in a conversation among ourselves, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. The main question, as you know, of this panel, of this conference is democracy under pressure? And the questions I would like you to address is really democracy under threat? What are the main threats? Is religious strife, ethnic strife, the rise of extremism? Is it the role of the markets and the pressure is putting on politicians to make decisions which sometimes are very unpopular, don't exactly work in tune with political cycles? Is what's happening in Europe right now a temporary phenomenon or something that's going to be around with us for a while, meaning the rise of extremism from Sweden and Holland down to Greece and Italy and Spain? Let me ask you, Carl, if you can start with some remarks on this.
Thanks, and always a true pleasure to be in Greece, and particularly to be in this particular, the most historic of settings possible to discuss the future of democracy. I mean, the question we are supposed to answer is democracy under strain? And I would broaden it and say, are our systems of governance under strain? And I would answer, yes, that is certainly the case. But then also broaden the answer somewhat, because we are living in a period of profound changes, probably the most profound and the most sweeping changes that mankind has been living through for quite some time. And I would argue essentially extremely positive changes. If you look at the record of the past 2 decades or something like that, I can argue, for the sake of the argument, that they might well have been the 2 best decades for mankind in living or in memory, or in recorded memory. If we look at 1 billion people lifting out of poverty, if you look at diseases being fought, if you look at the number of children who are attending school, if you look at the length of more people living longer and living better than ever before, and that is quite something. Why has this come about? Well, I would argue it's an effect of more open societies, more open governments, and more open economies, which has produced globalization with all of the changes for the better that entails. We see that also in the figures for governance, free societies versus unfree societies. I checked on the flight down the latest assessment by Freedom House, And with all of the limitations to these measurements, they say that we now have roughly 66% of the population of the world living in either free or partly free societies, 34% living in not free societies, and being somewhat undiplomatic, half of them are living in China. As we look ahead to the year 2030, the size of the global economy is likely to double. We will see the rise of a global middle class even more profoundly than we've seen so far. We've seen a declining gap between rich and poor. There will be more middle class than poor people in the world. That is the first time for recorded history. But at the same time, we see in the emerging middle class societies and economy an increasing expectations gap developing. People are expecting more than they feel that governance structures and governments can deliver. To some extent in Europe, Greece and other countries, that's to a large extent to do with sort of economic development. If we go to the Arab world, of course, it's a question of the demographic bulge explosion that is happening there with all of the consequences. And accordingly, because of this expectation gap in this increasingly middle-class world, we do have governance systems coming under stress everywhere, more or less. But I would argue that democratic systems will be far more capable of dealing with this increasing stress and strain than will be authoritarian government. I would argue, to be precise, that I would expect India 20 years from now to still be a vibrant democracy with all of the problems associated with vibrant democracies. But if you ask me to put a bet on whether the Communist Party of China is still going to be in power, I would have to be substantially more cautious for rather obvious reasons. Here in Europe, I think we have a particular challenge. Athens was a city-state. It inspired us for 2,500 years. But modern democracy is a function to a large extent of the emergence of the nation-states in Europe during a period of 100 or 200 years, however you care to define it. But what we are trying to do in Europe now is, of course, to build democracy beyond and above the nation-states, build governance structures that are multi-layered. You can say democratic multi-layered governance structures for an increasingly interconnected world. And that is something that is very difficult. It is work in progress. Rome was certainly not built in a day, and Brussels might not be the crowning achievement of human brilliance so far, at least. It is work in progress. And all of this also challenges a lot of concepts that are there. And what we do see in Europe today, has seen it before, is that the forces that are dangerous are there. I'm talking primarily, the Prime Minister spoke about extremism, and going back in the history, of course, we had the totalitarian extremists, the communists, the fascists, the Nazis. They are virtually gone, thanks God. But the forces of extreme nationalism should not be underestimated. I mean, just north of Greece, we had a decade of people destroying societies and killing each other due to extreme nationalist dreams and fears. It wasn't that long ago, and it wasn't that far away. And we do see within our own societies, as after a long period, when European societies, for better or worse, mostly for worse, I would argue, became far more homogeneous. They are now becoming somewhat more multicultural in different ways. And that imposes also different sorts of strains and different sorts of fears that we have to deal with. And we discuss the dangers of extremist nationalist forces, be that in Greece, be that in Bulgaria, be that in Hungary. But I would still argue that if you look across the electoral landscape of Europe, these are very marginal phenomena so far. They went backwards in the Netherlands, they failed and went backwards in France, and if you look at Germany in the electoral campaign there, they're virtually non-existent, which is a fairly good thing, to put it very mildly. The most powerful antidote that we have is the idea of Europe in all of its complexity, because it is a complicated idea. This idea that we should develop identities on different levels and governance on different levels. There will always be those who challenge it and say there's a simple, more tribal word available, and we should, under the strain of civilization, to take that old Popper concept, we should lurch back to the age of the tribes. But I do believe that in view of all of the positive changes that we see, within 5 years, 60% of the population of the globe will be covered by mobile broadband networks more powerful than those we have in Europe today. Under the influence of all of these developments, those forces are not going to be successful. So governance, to sum up, our systems of governance are under stress because of the rapid pace of change in the world. This change is essentially for the better, although those that don't adopt in time will have their difficulties. But it makes it imperative for us, active in public affairs and policies, to be developing and explaining these systems of governance. But by doing so in the open debates that once were initiated here in Athens, I think we'll once more demonstrate that the open systems of governance of democracy are far better capable of handling all of the strains and all of the tensions and all of the challenges than the authoritarian governments that are likely to continue to their march towards irrelevance if we look at it in a slightly longer perspective. Thanks.
Thank you. Masa, do you share Carl's optimism?
I'm not sure. What I want to talk about actually is the language of democracy, because you asked us to talk about the threats. And I was thinking about a time in March of 2000 when I went to Chechnya to cover the election of Vladimir Putin to be Russia's president. The election in Chechnya was very much like all elections in Russia would eventually become. It had a 100+% turnout. It had more than 95% voting for Putin. And in other words, it wasn't a real election. And, but what struck me actually when I went to the first polling place that I visited that day in Chechnya was the sign over the polling place. It said, "Dictatorship of the law," which was a term coined by Putin. And it was very much important of what would happen to the language over the next several years. And what happened to the language over the next several years was actually a repeat, a very rapid repeat of what had been happening to the language over the 70 decades of Soviet rule. In the Soviet Union, the words from the democratic vocabulary were used to mean their opposites. The so-called constitution protected so-called freedoms. People participated in so-called elections. And they didn't have a choice about participating in so-called elections in which one candidate was on the ballot, and not participating and not voting for that candidate was a crime. When the difficult to build a new system in the absence of a language in which it could be discussed, because the language had already been used to mean its opposite. And very, very quickly, after a very quick initial period of idealism, the language devolved to a state where the word democracy became a curse word. There appeared a new term, demshaza, which was a derogatory term for democratic activists. Demshaza means, it's a mixture of the word democratic and schizophrenic. And that's a word that's used to to refer to democratic activists, pro-democracy activists. There was another incredible derogatory term that appeared, which was based on, which came from Alexander Solzhenitsyn's essay, book-length essay, Live Not by Lies. So there appeared by the late 1990s the derogatory term, the Live Not by Liars. And the Live Not by Liars are people who are clearly not to be trusted. They're too earnest, they're too idealistic, and they rock the boat. Now, I've been thinking about that a lot just in the last few days after reading Vladimir Putin's op-ed in the New York Times, because it is a sterling example of that kind of use of language. He takes exception to American exceptionalism after having built an entire regime on the rhetoric of Russian exceptionalism. He says things like, I would hate to see the United Nations go the way of the League of Nations because it lacks the power to carry out its mandate, when of course it is Russia who over the last year and a half has been making sure that the United Nations lacks the power to carry out its mandate. He promises to act as the broker in negotiations with President Assad, with whom he strongly identifies personally. And at the same time, in the same op-ed piece, he says there's every reason to believe that it wasn't the regime that used chemical weapons, when of course there's no reason to believe that. What he does by hijacking the language and by hijacking that whole conversation is put the democratic regimes with which he forces into a dialogue into an impossible situation, because it is very difficult to challenge language that one side uses seriously, when one side is playing by the rules of this language, and the other side is again using it to mean its opposite. And I think this is a very, I think that my prognosis for what happens in the short term with Russia and Syria is very, very poor because of the very things that I just talked about, because it starts with a lie and the whole process is a lie. But I also think that obviously neither Assad's regime nor Putin's regime will last a very long time. But when they collapse, we will have that problem of the language that has been hijacked.
Sasi, your thoughts?
First of all, in this remarkable setting, I'd like to bring greetings from the world's largest democracy to the world's oldest democracy. Some of us had the great privilege of seeing the world's oldest ballot box and the foundations of the SKAI here. And it was a reminder of how long and how precious is the history of democracy right here and as we practice it around the world. I don't know if democracy is under pressure, but I come from a country where the parliamentarians are really under pressure because elections are looming in something like 7 or 8 months, and our country has a 26% re-election rate. So all the MPs are busy worrying about their own future. But what's interesting, of course, is that in India, we have, every time we hold a general election, it breaks our own world record for the largest exercise of democratic franchise in human history. Last time around, we had 734 million registered voters. I think it's pretty sure that given the continuing arrival of young people turning 18, that when the Election Commission releases the list for next year's election, we would be much closer to 800 million. And the thing is that with all of this, people do ask, how on earth do you manage to sustain democracy with this kind of size, this kind of numbers, this sort of challenge? Each of us as members of parliament represents a couple of million people. And it's sort of difficult to imagine. My constituency is larger than a majority of the countries in the United Nations in terms of people. So it is an extraordinary challenge. And yet, when you think of the extremely adverse circumstances in which India chose democracy upon independence, the horrors of the partition with Pakistan, with the flames of violence blazing across the land, 1 million people butchered, 13 million people losing their homes, billions of rupees of property damage. I mean, almost your classic recipe to say we need tough action, we need a firm hand on the tiller. And yet Nehru and their generation of our founding fathers insisted on choosing and working for democracy and instilling the habits of democracy on a people who had been denied it for centuries before, even though we too claim we had our ancient village republics and the Buddhist Sanghas and so on going back to a few centuries before Christ. But nonetheless, we hadn't had anything like democracy for a very long time when we re-embraced it in 1947. And it was a real challenge. I mean, Churchill, who has already been quoted by Roger, said that India is no more a united country than the equator. Now, Churchill was very rarely right about India, but on this particular point he was. I mean, this is a huge land with extraordinary diversities of topography, geography, climate, race or ethnicity, language, discourse of every sort. And yet it turned out that the choice of democracy was a masterstroke because it was the best political system to manage such extraordinary diversity. In fact, India has been able to demonstrate over these last 65 years of successfully functioning democracy that you can actually overcome differences of caste, of creed, of color, of culture, of cuisine, of conviction, of consonant, of costume and custom, and still manage a consensus. And in a large democracy, that consensus is on a very simple principle, that in a large and diverse country like India, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. And that's what democracy gives you the framework to be able to do. Now, Disagree We Do, one of the most celebrated books about India in recent years, is the Nobel Prize winning Amartya Sen's The Argumentative Indian. We're all notoriously argumentative. And it's pretty fundamental, our democratic challenge. About 50 years ago, seeing President Giscard here, I was reminded of Maurice Duverger's famous classification of democratic contestation into, as he said, three categories: conflict over fundamental principles, in which he included France in those days, conflict over subsidiary principles, and he mentioned the UK, and conflict without principles, he meant the US. But India is still today, well after Europe has graduated beyond that, a democracy where there is contestation over fundamental principles, where we are contested on the left by an active and thriving Communist Party, which would still like to impose democratic centralism on India and destroy the market, and on the right by forces of sectarian bigotry, of religious fundamentalism, and of a narrower perception of the Indian identity. And yet, despite these fundamental conflicts in which, Carl, you spoke of the idea of Europe, the idea of India, some would argue, is at stake, given that some are contesting the very philosophies that have underpinned our republic for 65 years, and they are active in the electoral space. Yet I found that India has been able to weather all these challenges over these 6.5 decades precisely because democracy has worked. And you've got, for example, armed secessionist movements, which have been diffused by incorporating them into the democratic space, disarming the secessionists who had killed people and letting them contest elections. So yesterday's secessionists, on numerous cases, became today's chief ministers of states, the states where they were fighting, and then, of course, given the vagaries of democracy, tomorrow's leaders of the opposition in those states. And we've been through this in several parts of the country already. The logic of the electoral marketplace, the nature of Indian civilization gives me great hope that our democracy, though it will be constantly under pressure in that sense, will be able to diffuse that pressure much as the pressure cooker lets through its valve, lets the steam off. I think we will as well. And as to the larger points that Carl has raised, I would say, yes, democracy is very much on the upswing throughout the world. India is glad to be part of that narrative. And while, yes, one has seen in recent years the upsurge of protests, I would argue that those protests are actually for democracy and not against it. They're actually reflecting the widening of greater democratic expectations in the Arab world, for example, and that therefore, as I've seen from the Indian experience, the response to them must be more democracy, because democracy offers the best way of enhancing your society's capacity to address those expectations. I think I should leave it there. I've used up my 5 minutes. But I think we've got enough common ground to go on language, yes, we certainly see some remarkably instructive uses of language, and in India's case of multiple languages being deformed, as it were, for the purposes of political discourse, but that's almost an entire other conversation.
Thank you, Sasha. Sultan, let me ask you, what is the future of democracy in the Middle East?
I'd like to pick up on the point that Minister Carl Bildt mentioned. I come from the part of the world that represents the 34% that lives in non-democratic environment. The future of democracy, I think, is bright in the Middle East. But I believe that the forces that are against it are so numerous that it will require not just the people from the Middle East working, but the international community assisting the people of the Middle East and the Arab world to come out of these decades of autocracy and dictatorships that they have been living in. In fact, economic conditions are put democracy under pressure. For example, right now, I would classify Tunisia as the only country that is the closest to being a democracy in the Arab world. And yet, even in Tunisia, after 2.5 years of the so-called Arab Spring, at a recent poll, but Pew Research conducted, 56 or 58% said that they would prefer stability over democracy, only because people have been waiting for so long. So time isn't on our side. Economic conditions aren't on our side. Military rule isn't on our side. Counter-democratic forces aren't on our side, whether they were internal or regional. There is so much pressure going on from the old regimes that they would like to maintain the status quo. The merchant class doesn't like democracy only because they're happy with the system where their corruption is more or less legalized and they're entrenched, and they know how to conduct their business that way. In fact, in the Arab world, according to the United Nations Human Development Report, which was written more than 10 years ago, there has been warnings of the need for democratic change, for the democratic deficit, the human rights deficit, the women's rights deficit, and all these other issues that are very important and yet neglected by these countries. In fact, in one research, it is estimated that that the Arab world needs to create between 75 to 100 million jobs in the next decade to keep the unemployment rate as it is. And that half the Arab world is under 25 years old. And so in some countries, as in the Gulf states, the government, they either pay so much money to create jobs or they hire people in the security sector, which for example, Saudi Arabia has done instant job creation, 50,000, 60,000 people overnight in the security sector. It's quite smart if you think about it. The Syrian regime, I think, has adapted the strategy of maybe killing those who are unemployed so that to minimize their number. So I don't know where we are going from here. All I know is that we really need to have a positive example in the Arab world. We need to have an example that is non-sectarian. Lebanon and Iraq are sectarian democracies where the president has to be from a certain sect. The prime minister has to be from a certain sect. The speaker of parliament has to be from a certain sect. And it really doesn't work in a democratic, in the essence of democracy isn't reflected. And we think of India, for example, in which there is a rotation of power that is true and genuine. So I truly believe that as soon as we have one genuine example of democratic success in the Arab world, that will serve as a beacon for the other people in the Arab world to point to and hopefully emulate one day.
Thank you, Sultan. Well, Roger, let me ask you, how democracy is doing in America. And let me ask you more specifically. As you know, there's a debate going on around the world these days about President Obama's decision to go to Congress about Syria. Half of the people are saying that this makes the US more of a powerful country because it shows how democracy works in its more brilliant form. Others say that it makes a much less powerful country and that perhaps President Obama has lost, along with the country, a lot of the prestige that they used to have. Your assessment on this?
Well, since 9/11, you saw a fairly radical tilt in the United States toward the executive, toward the White House. A lot of power was concentrated in the presidency to wage war not only in Iraq, also in Afghanistan. And I think we're coming out of the post 9/11 period now. And I think the president rightly felt a great concern that he should not take this decision without going to Congress. What worried me was that he also found it okay on a matter of war and peace that 10 days elapsed before Congress ambled back to Washington and into session. What also worries me is that according to our latest New York Times poll, 64% of Americans now think that foreign conflicts, foreign difficulties are best left to the foreigners involved to work out. And I was thinking, as Carl, as you spoke, this great spread of liberty, of freedom that the world has undergone in the last 2-3 decades, and the upholding of freedom throughout the Cold War was based on the notion that an American red line, I mean, if in Berlin an American red line had meant nothing, what would have happened to West Berlin? This was a Pax Americana that we lived. And what does it mean for the democracies of the world if indeed we are at a pivot point where the United States, after the experience of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the painful experience, the United States is now stepping back. And to Masha's point, I think we've seen, I mean, the White House is trying to spin this as best it can, but I think facing an adverse vote in Congress, in essence, the president scrambled to get out of this hole he dug himself into. And the exit method was none other than our friend Vladimir Putin, who then lectures us in the pages of the New York Times on international law and democracy. So that, I think, is a very worrying development. And I'd like to ask you, Carl, are you not worried in the light of what seems to me to be this trend in the U.S.? Is Pax Americana coming to an end? Do U.S. red lines no longer mean something? And in that case, isn't the free world of liberal democracies at risk? I know we're moving into this new interconnected world, and there are other ways in which peoples now speak to each other. But aren't those garrisons in the end, those American garrisons scattered throughout Europe and Asia and elsewhere, haven't they been the cornerstones on which this freer, more democratic world has been built?
I think it's certainly true that American military power, to be precise, was instrumental in containing the threats against democracy, primarily here in Europe, but also elsewhere. But it was containing them. It didn't go on the offensive in military terms. The challenge to the dictatorship was ideological, and the success of democracy was due to the decay and collapse, the failure of the dictatorships and other doctrines under the ideological and economic challenge. I agree, military containment was absolutely essential, but the success came primarily from other factors. So that's my reading of history. As to the present and what we are seeing happening, what slightly worries me, I do think that the outcome after sort of the week of whatever it was better than the alternative, far better than the alternative, because it could open the way to a political process in Syria. Remains to be seen if that happens, but anyhow.
Do you believe in a political settlement with Assad is possible?
I don't believe...
After 110,000 dead, 2 million refugees, 7 million displaced, what opposition group is going to make a deal with this man?
Well, we go back to some of us being extensively involved in the Balkan Wars. Yeah. We had more than 100,000 dead in Bosnia. And at the end of the day, everyone recognized that there had to be a political settlement. Because if you go on just killing and killing and killing and killing and killing, there won't be any society left to rescue. Will it be possible? I don't know. I don't know. But I think as diplomats and politicians, we have to work for that, because the alternative is even worse. But what worries me, or could worry me, in the sort of the American attitude or whatever, is America is, of course, a country that goes between one pole and another, and is gone from a period of hyper-interventionism to a period of perhaps too reluctant interventionism. I was somewhat skeptical against the hyper-interventionism that was there for a period, the belief that send in a couple of cruise missiles and an armor division, and we will have happiness and democracy flourish forever to come. It didn't really work out. But I'm also afraid of the alternative. I mean, to paraphrase or quote, as a matter of fact, the President of the United States, we've done wars, now it's time for nation building at home. That worries me. An America that sort of retreats too much from what might have been too much in the other direction. And here I hope that, and all of the management and dealing with Syria, Egypt, the Arab world is going to be, I remember saying that when there was the pivot to Asia. I think I said, this is going to fail, I said to American friends, because you will be dragged in back into the Middle East with a vengeance, because that's where everything is going to come to its test, and that's where we are.
If I could chip in on Roger's question, though, not so much on the Syria issue, but specifically going back to democracy, which is what we're supposed to be discussing. I don't think it's such a bad thing if America and Western countries don't attempt to actively promote democracy. Because democracy is rather like love. It cannot be imposed from the outside. The best we can do is provide the candlelit dinners and the romantic music, but people have to want democracy from within, and it absolutely has to come from within. Sultan also said that the Arab countries hope for support in all of this, and that support is the best we can offer. The UN Democracy Fund is offering instruction if people want it. India has taken this attitude. We've never tried to preach democracy to any country, but if somebody wants us to help them run a free election, as Egypt asked us to do the last time around, with, as we know, at the end, unhappy results, we did send our election commission to make it happen. And we do believe that essentially that's the best we can do, is to accompany a process that must come from within. At the same time, going back to Sultan's point about sectarian democracy and so on, in our country, with the diversity we have, I mean, the 2004 elections are a classic case of a non-sectarian outcome, where the election was won by a political party, now mine as it happens, but I wasn't there at the time, headed by a woman of Catholic faith and Italian descent, who then ceded place to a Sikh, that's about 2% of our population represented there, who was sworn in as prime minister by a Muslim president. The Muslims are about, in those days, 14% of our population, in a country that's 81% Hindu. And no one actually thought about it very much. It was just the natural processes of India being itself. And ultimately, that seems to me to be the only viable way forward in creating democracy as an instrument of pacification within societies, is by letting that process take its place. So without belaboring the point, yes, 64% of the American people are echoing, who was it, John Adams, wasn't he, that America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy, but nor, I think, in terms of trying to change the internal arrangements of societies. I mean, I've spoken to Afghans, I've spoken to Iraqis, Pakistanis, and no one is particularly keen on America dealing with their internal arrangements. Everyone is keen on the security umbrella and all the other benefits, trade, aid, everything else, but they want to draw the line at America or any other Western country telling them how to live. And I think that's something we all need to acknowledge right up here.
Asa, you want to jump in? Or?
No, but yes.
Okay. Sultan? Okay.
Sultan, could I just ask you, 25% of the Arab world or so lives in Egypt. Egypt held, with Indian help, a free and fair election just over a year ago, in which, remarkable thing in the Arab world, a president was elected with 51.7% of the vote. We know what happened. A year later, President Morsi was deposed in the coup that will not speak its name. And here we have the army extending now the state of emergency from 1 month to 3 months. And how significant for everything you want to see in the Arab world is this apparent failure of Egypt to move forward into a more open and democratic system?
I think democracy won't flourish in the Arab world unless it flourishes in Egypt. Egypt not only represents the largest demographic in the Arab world, but it's the biggest cultural, diplomatic, military power in the Arab world. Unfortunately, the Egyptian experience, the short experience with democracy, ended in a failure. The political party that was elected was not accommodating the opposition and ruled really on its own and had alienated everybody else. No one supports, I think, the outcome, and there was a massacre that took place after the president was deposed that I think everybody would condemn. But at the same time, we cannot give up and ignore Egypt. Egypt will need support, will need perhaps outside pressure. Right now, the Gulf states are stepping in. Where I come from, they're stepping in with economic help for Egypt. But part of that economic help, the billions of dollars, allows Egypt not to take the difficult decisions that the IMF and World Bank wants it to take, whether it's lifting subsidies or implementing economic reforms. And this is a mistake that we have seen take place in Egypt. I just want to remind you that before the Arab uprising, before the Egyptian uprising in 2011, Egypt was growing at 5% per annum. That is a dream rate for any country of, not India obviously, but any other country. It's a dream rate to have 5% economic growth, and yet people still had the uprising against the government. And if democracy is continued to be perpetually postponed in Egypt, I really foresee another uprising in Egypt unless they go back to democracy as soon as possible.
Carl, let me ask you, if I could, there's a lot of concern about the upcoming European elections, as you know. People predict, and the polls predict more importantly, a rise of nationalists and extremists from the Eurosceptics in England to the Golden Dawn in Greece. A, are you concerned about it? B, what does this mean for the European project? And C, what do we do to deal with it politically?
I am concerned with it, and it is sort of a structural problem that we have. I mean, when we fight elections in Greece or in Sweden, it's a fairly clear proposition who's going to be in government. Are we going to throw that prime minister out, and are we going to get this guy in to simplify things? There might be an ideological component as well, but I mean, that's the way it looks to the voters. And that sort of agitates people, and it mobilizes them, and it arouses interest, and television debates, and whatever. If you go to our system of governance on the European level, it's a much more complex system. And it's always going to be a coalition government, because Europe is about uniting nations and ideologies and whatever. There's never going to be that sort of digital contest on the European level as it is on the national level. Accordingly, we've got a problem with turnout. And that makes it easier for the one or the other extreme group that has a more limited electorate, but mobilizes them. I mean, the UKIP, or we had the Pirate Party for a while in Sweden and for a while in Berlin, and we're going to have these other movements. Yes, it does worry me that due to the fact that we have difficulties mobilizing the broad sectors of the electorate for that particular election, it opens up for these forces to be unproportionally represented on the European level. And here I think we, as sort of democratic politicians of the broad center, so to say, with sort of 80% of Europe, we really have a duty in explaining this in order to prevent what I believe will remain fairly marginal phenomena from getting an unduly big impact and influence.
Let me now open up the discussion to you as well. If you have any questions for any of the panelists. Kostas Karas, yes.
Yes. If we agree, as perhaps many of us, certainly I do, with Dr. Tharoor, that India is a good example of a democracy which has managed to incorporate very different traditions, cultural traditions, then should we not question, Mr. Qasim, your attitude to Lebanon? Your attitude to Lebanon. I have traveled in almost all the Arab countries over the last 60 years, and it is by far the freest country in my experience, with far greater not just individual freedom but group freedom, and with far ahead of all the other countries around it in that period. Now, I agree that it is a restriction on democracy that positions should be restricted to a certain group, but it is surely far better that all groups should be represented than that a majority should be able to override, whether in a dictatorial or a semi-democratic manner, other groups. I would put that question to you. Thank you.
I think it's Sultan or...
Is that to Sultan or to me? Sorry.
To both.
To both of us. The question was, wouldn't the Lebanese arrangement be preferable to one where
with the
one
quotas
somebody
for the
takes
ethnic
over?
groups?
I don't want to see someone grow up in a country where he or she will never have the opportunity to become a prime minister, or he or she will never have the opportunity to become Speaker of Parliament, merely because of the sect that he or she comes from, merely because of the ethnic group that he or she comes from. I think that is a completely wrong system of model. You have to allow everyone to dream and to hope and to aspire. And as soon as you put these limitations, you kill that hope in the young generation, and that's what we've been suffering from in the Arab world for close to 60 years.
That would have been my answer too, absolutely. Sultan is right.
Thank you. My question, first of all, let me say something about one misconception, particularly to the gentleman from the UAE. There is no Arab country, there are 22 countries, each one is sovereign, so you cannot really aggregate them and give them certain descriptions that can and are really lost in translation. This is number one. And number two, you have been also saying that the Arab countries with Arab population, yes, there are many populations, but you never mentioned that. And I would like to quote a Greek. I'm sorry, I don't speak Greek. It's a beautiful language. But there is a Greek proverb that summarizes the misconception that, unless you did not want to tackle that point, and that is the smell of the bad odor of the fish comes from the head. All right? So it is, I want to go back to the first gentleman there, and that's where the real issue is. The real issue is not democracy or what. The real issue is governance. If democracy, irrespective of how you define it, and there are many definitions, if it satisfies the governance, at least a good balance in accountability, in transparency, and in participation in the governance, then that is democracy. Short of that, I don't think so. And I think there will be trouble. And like one of the great thinkers, Ibn Khaldun, said, when the welfare in society ebbs, like the tide, then you see the cesspools. And if you compare today the good, rich countries, like the United States, its power is in, it was able to harness the different myriad of nationalities and ethnic groups into one crucible for the social good.
If we can keep it there, because
thank you. My question
it's becoming a Greek question, open-ended question, meaning.
Sorry.
Is there a question that you want to address? Specific question?
Yes, this is the question to the difference between democracy and governance. Okay. Thank you.
Anybody wants to take a... It's definitely the call. Yes,
well, I'm not quite certain, but I wanted perhaps to return to Kostaka's question, where both of you said no. And I would in principle agree with you, but I would say yes, but. It's not the ideal. It's not the society that I would dream of, but a society coming out of a conflict. Lebanon had 15 years of civil war, and then there was an extremely complex arrangement.
Despite the arrangement, Carl, the arrangement was already in place when they had the civil war.
It was already in place.
Yeah. So
True.
It didn't prevent civil war.
It didn't prevent civil war, absolutely, because it broke down. And we've seen other examples of that. But sometimes you need sort of that sort of arrangement in order for society to come to terms with itself. And I mean, Bosnia doesn't have the ideal governance arrangements, I would say. Some were involved in an unplanned for Cyprus, which is a very complicated arrangement, along sometimes the same lines. Sometimes you need these arrangements to overcome a period in history, and without saying it's ideal in any sort of way, history moves in different phases sometimes.
Isn't it a contradiction that on the one hand we speak of how cultured and educated and free-spirited the people are, and on the other hand we deny them the prospect of aspiring to lead their own societies because they belong to the wrong sect? It seems to me that that's precisely why Sultan and I are saying it doesn't work. I mean, in our own subcontinent, we have a country, India, where it's built a democracy where anybody can aspire to be anything, and people do. We've had every conceivable sort of difference. And then you've got next door a country where they stamp non-Muslim on your passport and deprive you from every constitutional office above a certain level unless you're Muslim. And I think there is a huge difference between what it must be like for a young person of the non-majority sect to grow up in any of these societies.
Quite, but it's not a question of denying anyone. It's a question of perhaps having governance systems that is somewhat more complicated. Belgium is another case. We're going to have a referendum in Scotland on independence, which is going to be an interesting one.
You don't say that the Prime Minister must be a Wallon because the King is a whatever.
No, and I wouldn't agree with anything of that. But you do see sort of a devolution of powers, and then you have an arrangement that is de facto coalition government between the different national or other interests. A somewhat more complex governance structure might sometimes be called for in order to overcome divisions that are essentially coming out of the past. If you look at the European history, there have been X numbers of such examples. Then we agree where we like to move. But we also know that it could Iraq was mentioned. Iraq is another sort of example where you have this sort of arrangements, sort of, not blocking anyone, but they say that we've got Sunni and Shia there, and the Kurds must have the speaker and the foreign minister and whatever. I hope in 15, 20 years' time it's going to be different. But when you are coming out of conflict, it can sometimes be somewhat difficult.
One of the ironies is it denies the extraordinary history of democracy in recent years, where a country like Jamaica, 97% black, elects a non-black Prime Minister in Edward Siaga, where Guyana, 99% black and Indian, elects a white woman as president. I mean, anything is possible if you let voters decide. And I think it's wrong for governance systems to lock predetermined outcomes into place.
Mr. Rapanos?
How do you see the globalized markets being compatible with democracy? What I see is a rise in tyranny of markets. Is this compatible with democratic values as we know them? Thank you.
Roger?
Well, I think it is, as I suggested in my very brief remarks at the beginning, I think it is highly problematic because the timetable of markets is not the timetable of human change. The timetable of markets is instantaneous. It's our devices, clicks, and human change is often generational, particularly when you're moving from one system of government to another. So markets can create unsustainable pressures on democracies and on those leading them. And I was thinking when Carl said, and I agree with him fundamentally, when he said that he asked, what is
our fundamental defense against extremism, demagoguery, populism, against the anti-democratic, far right, far left. And he said, our ultimate defense is Europe. And his history teaches us, the history of the last 70 years tells me that that is so, along with the transatlantic alliance. But we now have a very complicated situation where, for example, in Greece, the perception is that the market, let's call it the market, or at least economic demand, is incarnated in this odd thing called the troika. And here sits this thing called the troika, representing kind of economic good sense, the market, etc. And here is the elected prime minister, and we listened to earlier a remarkable speech, I thought, from Antonis Samaras. And the perception in Greece is that, in fact, the country is not being run by the prime minister, or the perception among many Greeks, but it's being run by the troika, by the market, by these forces. And I think that's a dangerous situation because it leads to a sense of national humiliation. It gives rise to conspiracy theories. I think there's this phrase in Greece that's used quite widely and is a very ominous phrase, speaking of language, Masha, which is the international loan sharks. Well, I've heard language like that before, and I didn't hear it myself, but I've read about it in 1930s Europe. So I think we do face a genuine dilemma, and I'm not sure that the European Union has worked out in this crisis how to give citizens the sense that they really are still living in democracies and they're not being somehow controlled from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting situation you're all facing here because obviously the whole idea of democracy is to provide space for competing conceptions of the good life, and markets are ways of achieving that good life in theory. And so one could argue that efficient and transparent markets could encourage democracy. But at the same time, obviously, market institutions cannot substitute for democratic institutions. And when you see the kinds of constraints that markets are imposing upon politics, as Roger has just summarized in the Greek example, you do worry about timetables, markets reacting instantly. Politicians themselves are fairly short-term. Most politicians in most democracies are governed by what works in the next election. And if markets are imposing structural changes, the benefits of which will take 10 years or 15 years for people to truly realize and see how well they worked, then you're probably better off being Pinochet than being Samaras. Because the fact is that when you're facing an electorate that has felt the pain and not yet seen the gain, you're in trouble. But still, the choice to be governed by those market impulses is still a democratic choice. There are democratically elected politicians who are making the decision to accept the conditions and the constraints that the Troika and everyone else is imposing upon them.
The other side of the question that Vasilis Rapanos asked is something that Roger alluded to before. Goes back to that famous writing by Thomas Friedman saying that if Europe could become China or Russia for a couple of days, they would solve all our problems in terms of efficiency, competitiveness, and so on.
I wouldn't necessarily say that neither Russia nor China are examples of efficiency and transparency in any sort of way. But going back to our sort of exposure to the markets, where does it come from in the most acute cases? It comes from you having borrowed too much money. Is this something new that has come recently? I mean, going back to sort of the history of sort of independent Greece, I think Greece have gone bankrupt quite a number of times. If we go back
3 or 4 times.
3 or 4 times in the 19th century. Go back to the Ottoman Empire, which went sort of bust de facto, and there was so-called capitulations. They had borrowed money from the French or the Russians or the English. They couldn't pay the money, and the countries imposed order or whatever they imposed on the Ottoman Empire. So it's nothing new.
Look what happened to the Ottoman Empire.
And look what happened to the Ottoman Empire, true, for other reasons, I would argue. But anyhow, if you borrow money, you give away part of your sovereignty. And you give it to, and I think markets have become more nervous. And why have markets become more nervous? I think markets are driven by essentially demography, in the sense that people are living longer, they need pensions, A lot of the money that is there is savings money. 401k in the US, and they want to have return on their savings money. Otherwise, they lose out in old age. So they become more nervous, but you can avoid it by not borrowing money and having a competitive economy. Then you are the master of the markets and don't become the master that is subject to them too much.
That's an interesting thought. You mentioned demography in the context of people living longer and having expectations of pensions and so on. And Sultan said something none of us picked up on earlier, that the demography of the Arab world, of people who are so young and their needs for jobs and so on. I mean, India, Sultan, is even worse off in that sense, or better off depending on how you see them, because 65% of our population right now is under 35, and 540 million of us are under 25. So, in fact, I saw a study that, you know, between those Indians between 10 and 19, because I'm Minister for Education, so I worry about that, are 224 million right now, okay? Now, what's interesting is you can look at this in a positive light. The ILO did a study, the International Labour Organization, saying that this means that, say, in 2020, India will have people about to start work, that is a 20 to 24 age group, 116 million ready and available, when China will have dropped to only 94 million, and of course, Europe and Japan and even China will be beginning to age. Japan, the average age will be 47 in less than 10 years' time. So maybe the solution will be for us to export Arabs and Indians to all of you to support your long-term pension funds by working hard for you.
Actually, you already do. You already do.
Illegally.
No, not illegally. I mean, one of the things that we've changed in Sweden is that we open up our labor market. I mean, our IT industry could not be sustained without engineers coming in from India. And if you look at the long-term demographic development of Europe, where we need to go back to the pensioners, we need to pay the social welfare system. 50% of the social spending of the world is in Europe. So we have, this is probably the most decent place in the world to live in, by the way, but it happens to be expensive. In order to sustain this, we need to have people coming from different corners of the world to work in Europe as well. And that is why the sort of preserving the open nature of our societies is not only a question of ideology or values, as we would discuss here. It's a question of economic, demographic necessity for Europe. And what's going to be and that's going to be the big dilemma for Japan, which is a very closed society in these respects, or where China is going to head in that particular respects, 50 or 60 or 70 years down the road, or Russia, which is another country in sort of profound demographic decline. That remains to be seen.
China with the added complication of one Chinese supporting 4 grandparents because of their one-child policy for 30, 40 years.
And no pension system.
And no pension system.
Any other questions, or somebody in the back? Mr. Konono in the back. Okay.
Καθηγητής Theophanidis. Well, I am going to ask a question, but very first of all, I would like to correct a misconception. Democracy was not born in Athens, in Pnika, as a lot of people think. Democracy was born in the very, very first city of the world, which was on the island of Limnos in northern Aegea. Here is the place, the very first city of the world was Polyochni, and there they developed the system of democracy. And I have here...
If we can get to the question. If
Well, just a lot of people think that democracy is the best political system. Democracy is linked with great mistakes and wrongs and crimes as well. Democracy killed the wisest man on earth, Socrates. My question, how can we improve democracy? As I thought this idea, I found another political system better than democracy, sophocracy, ruling by the wisest men and women. Could we just adjust our democracy to find the wisest men and women to govern us? Thank you.
Okay, we'll get one more question from back there from Mr. Economopoulos, and then...
Thank you. I'm afraid I'm missing something, and please let me concentrate in my country, in our country. The question is free to be taken by any of the esteemed speakers. My perception from history is that democracy requires two minimum preconditions: educated individuals, citizens within a specific system, and a certain level of collective prosperity. Without these, history proves that democracy demises. So my question is whether you feel that democracy, under the current circumstances in Greece, is simply under pressure, or whether it is under threat. And if yes, what would be the suggestion in order to avoid the results that the Great Depression had in democracy in Europe, which led to the demise of democracies and the demise of peace? Thank you.
Want to take a break of this?
Yeah, well, I don't agree with the premise that democracy requires a certain level of prosperity, because India adopted democracy when it was a wreck, when it had just emerged from 2 centuries of colonial exploitation, and where 90% of the population were living below a poverty line that had been drawn barely this side of the funeral pyre. So there was an extraordinary affirmation of faith in the wisdom of the unlettered and the poor, which I believe has been vindicated through the evolution of Indian democracy over 65 years, when the main nationalist movement kept winning elections, and then indeed it's got to a point where no Indian election is won by any party. Every government is now a coalition for the last 20 years. So you've seen the democracy evolve through the native wisdom of the electorate, even while prosperity has moved, yes, but moved much more slowly than the theorists of democracy. I remember reading a theory that you had to have a per capita income of at least $3,000 a year to be able to afford democracy. I mean, this sort of nonsense, which was widely believed at one time, but which I believe the experience of India, which is why I spoke about it, gives the lie to. So I would argue that no, democracy, in my view, is in better health around the world today than it has ever been in human history. Carl cited Freedom House. The Economist magazine's Democracy Index has even more encouraging figures. And I would argue that many of those that are unfree are actually becoming freer or facing calls to become freer, as we've seen in the Arab Spring. So I would certainly be reluctant to have any acid test of either income or means or anything else for justifying what works for democracy. As for the first question, of course, about choosing the rule of the wise, the real question is, how do you choose the wise? Who determines that? You'll have to find wise people to choose other wise people, and the process of finding those wise people may end up being an election that will end up replicating democracy. I mean, the irony of all of these systems is that, yes, sometimes the people's wisdom elects people who many of the so-called wise or the educated classes are embarrassed to admit as their leaders. We've seen some of that in our democracy, certainly. But then everybody gets the leadership they deserve. You know, if the wise feel poorly represented by the elected leaders, let them educate the electors by going out and campaigning and writing and speaking and talking to people, and get them to elect wiser leaders, and let them begin to participate in politics more actively than the wise tend to do in most democracies.
Awesome.
Today, where will you
can
go?
all take a trip to
Oracle.
Delphi. But,
exactly.
but awesome.
What has happened in Russia over the last 15 years is actually offers some interesting insights into the relationship between prosperity and at least the democratic impulse. Because the oil boom was key to keeping Putin in power and to allowing him to amass power, because people were starting to live a lot better. And it was very difficult to recognize that things were getting worse when they were getting so much better. But at the same time, after about 10 years of growing prosperity, people's primary political motivation changed. And that, I think, is the biggest thing that contributed to shaping the protest movement a couple of years ago. Because after the traumatic 1990s, when the entire country ended up, if not in poverty, then at least staring at the very real possibility of personal poverty, and the primary political motivation was survival, growing prosperity meant that the primary political motivation changed. After about 10 years of growing prosperity, people realized, most people realized that they no longer risked slipping into poverty. And all of a sudden, they developed an interest in good governance and lack of corruption and all the things that drove them into the streets to demand fair elections and a fight and a war on corruption. It's very interesting to see what happened again to rhetoric when that happened, because Putin immediately began to see the middle class as his personal enemy and the middle class as a foreign agent. The Kremlin has advanced this idea that these protests were protests of angry urban people, which is sort of a stand-in for the relatively prosperous middle class. In fact, they were not the protests of angry urban people. All social strata were equally represented in the protests, and Russia is an 80% urban country, so that's kind of a meaningless term. But what that stands for is, the dissatisfied, the too rich, who all of a sudden, in his mind and in the mind of a small nationalist constituency, became foreign agents.
Your question, sir, about whether Greek democracy is under pressure or under threat. I would say for the moment that Greek democracy is under pressure. But at the same time, I think you do have a kind of perfect storm in Greece, an ominous perfect storm, in that you have a sense of national humiliation, you have a grave economic crisis, you have a perception, as I was saying earlier, that power is being manipulated from the outside. You have a fairly traumatic history that is not so far distant that it's beyond memory in the country itself. And that tells me, we're not in the 1930s, but all those elements were present in the 1930s. That tells me that if you don't want to pass from being under pressure to being under threat, you have to be a little bit careful. And that's where I think that the Troika, I think if the Troika comes here next week, for example, and places additional demands on Greece in the form of further cutting pensions or further cutting jobs or whatever, that could really be explosive in the current environment, because I think this is, right now, this feels to me like a fairly combustible place. And when you have a combustible environment, you don't want to go tossing gasoline around. So I think you want to be fairly careful. And yeah, I totally agree with you on your question, sir. Your wise man may be my fool, and vice versa. And that brings us back to Churchill, saying that democracy was the very worst form of government, except for any other that anybody has been able to think of. Nobody, I think, in this room would argue that democracy as practiced today is an ideal system that satisfies everyone. But ask people in this room if they'd rather have 10% growth as there is in China today, or be able to go out in the street and speak their minds freely. Well, I certainly know where I come down on that.
And I would certainly as well. But going back to one remark that was there, saying the Athenian democracy killed Socrates. It did. So what was the fault? Well, yes, quite. Absolutely. There were evidently divided views on that one. But anyhow, what was the fault of Athenian democracy? Well, Athenian democracy, to simplify things, was majority rule more than the rule of the law. And what we need and what we have, primarily in Europe, is, of course, we have democracy in open societies. But we also have rule of the law. The majority is not absolute in its powers. We have a concept that we haven't touched upon that is called human rights and protection for human rights. And even the most solid of majority in our democratic countries is not allowed to do certain things that infringes on the human rights of individuals. And democracy, as a matter of fact, one of the chief advantages of the democracy, I would say, if not the number one, is that it is the system that is best at protecting human rights, because also the rule of the law. And what we have in Europe, with all of this bureaucracy in Brussels and Strasbourg and all of the messy things, we have a system of institutions and rules and laws covering the entire European continent. We even have a European Court of Human Rights, where individuals can go to that particular court. It takes a long time, but even sort of the Russian government can lose a case in the European Court of Human Rights. Even the British government loses cases to their immense irritation. And that is something we didn't have before. And that even if sort of democracy comes under strain in different countries, I think this is going to temper it, and this is going to moderate it, and this is going to be sort of a safety, a safety system, I think you can say, for democracy in Europe for all of the time that these institutions are going to be there.
I want to end up with this on an optimistic note. So I want to ask each of you, because you've been around, you met with interesting people, you met with protesters, with democracy fighters around the world. So I want each one of you to find an example of a personal hero, of an experience you had, that makes you optimistic that democracy will survive despite all the odds and all the predictions to the contrary. Asa?
I'm not particularly optimistic, so you're putting me in a difficult position. So if I may, will subvert the question. And actually, I want to take issue with what you said earlier about democracy needing to flower on its own because of a native desire. The problem is that the longer a totalitarian or authoritarian rule is allowed to go on, the more it corrupts the society which it rules, and the less likely that something will flower there. And that, I think, is the strongest argument there is for some kind of intervention. And I have to say that my heroes in Russia, of whom there are many, are facing a situation of increasing despair, increasing loss of hope. But I guess if I had to choose somebody, I would choose the two women who are in prison now, who are members of Pussy Riot, a punk collective that was three members of which were sentenced to 2 years in prison for a 40-second peaceful protest. And two of them remain in prison. And they have both found remarkable ways of existing in captivity. And they have found ways to speak out and to find a pulpit. They have taken very different approaches to using the Russian courts, which are, by definition, they serve at the pleasure of the executive branch. They are not courts in any normal understanding of what a court of law should be. At the same time, one of them, and they have chosen opposite approaches. One of them, Maria Alyokhina, goes to court. She goes to court just about every month to show what the court is like. And every hearing that she participates in ends with her turning her back to the court after the court has violated her rights to be represented yet again, and pointing out, being very precise and pointing out exactly what is wrong with the Russian courts. The other one, Nadezhda Tolokonnikova, has taken the exact opposite tack. She also goes to court about every month. She finds a way to do that. But she doesn't address the court. She addresses the public. She has found ways to give brilliant speeches in Russian courts, which have no choice but to provide her with an opportunity to do that. I think they're both inspiring, and what little hope I have right now, I'd say they give me.
Off the top of my head, I would think of the president of Tunisia today, for example, who was a human rights activist, who was jailed and exiled for years outside his country, and now is the president of that country. And I also want to say that I am optimistic. 2014, you have story altogether. But you do have elections in all of these 5 countries, which is a majority of the Arab world. And what is the international community doing today to make them, to be sure that these are free and fair elections? Are there monitors? Is the EU coming in to supply monitors or funding for monitors? But ultimately, I am hopeful. 2014 could end in a very, very positive note. Could end in a negative note, but again, I am an eternal optimist, and I do feel that by this time next year, the Arab world will be in a much better shape than it is today.
I am fairly optimistic. as I've been saying. I mean, take what I consider perhaps the most complicated country in terms of the challenges it faces would be Pakistan. 200 million people. Any problem you can think of, they have it in abundance and somewhat more than that. Still, rule of the law, sort of. Democracy, sort of. They has completed a democratic transfer of power, sort of. Nothing perfect. Take another country, 500 million people in Indonesia, ethnic, cultural diversity, military rule, secession, wars, communist coups, you name it. Fairly stable democratic governance today. So if they can do it in India, we've already covered, but that's a long-running success story. But if they can do it in Indonesia, if they can do it in Pakistan, if they can have an opening in Myanmar, I see no reason why we should be pessimistic in Europe, where everything is much better and much easier.
Yes, my optimism comes from the experience of what used to be called the Indian subcontinent. We now call it South Asia, but the 7 countries there have all had a fascinating narrative, full of challenges, as Carl said about one of them, and yet democracy has gained ground everywhere. And you can start from the top and go down. Bhutan was an autocratic monarchy. The monarch himself ceded place not only to constitutional monarchy, but obliged the citizens of his country to adopt democracy that they were not seeking, actually. But it was very interesting. The first election, everybody voted for those whom they thought the king might value. The next election, they turfed them all out and brought in the then opposition. So you've really got democracy taking root there. Nepal, just recently a Maoist civil war, an insurrection. They're having a mess writing a new constitution, but democracy prevails. Bangladesh, 2 decades of military rule. They've had 2 democratic elections that have worked, and women leaders, in fact, in charge of them. Sri Lanka, end of a brutal civil war. One may have issues about the nature of the sort of aftermath, as it were, but free and fair elections are being held. The Maldives, we had a story very much like this, a human rights activist and dissident who had been jailed by a tyrant, winning a free and fair election, becoming president. Then we had a sad footnote. He was unseated at the point of a gun. But here's the next footnote. He is back, having won the first round of an election with a good 46%, and is now facing a runoff. So he might be back in office. And then Pakistan, the first time in the 65-year history of Pakistan, a government has served a democratically elected government has served an entire term and lost an election and handed over power to the next democratically elected government. Yes, undoubtedly shadowed by the military, which still calls a shot. I mean, I sometimes joke that in India, I paraphrase Voltaire on Prussia, in India the state has an army, in Pakistan the army has a state. But still under that, we still have actually seen a democratic transition. So right across the subcontinent, all 7 countries, you've seen democracy growing and flourishing, and that offers tremendous hope. So if you want to pick a hero, I guess pick either the now ex-king of Bhutan or the perhaps to be once and future president of the Maldives. There are people who put their lives on the line and done wonderfully well.
I guess I would have to, not one particular person, but just one of the countless people that I met in Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt during the extraordinary upheaval of the Arab Spring. And one thing was shared by almost all of them. And when I asked, what are you feeling? Why are you here? Why are you out here in the street? And the answer I got most often was, because for the first time in my life, I feel that my voice might be heard. I feel that my actions might change something. I feel that I have agency. And, in the end, I think that is what democracy was about. President Giscard d'Estaing talked about the beginning of democracy being the ability, the freedom to raise your voice and believe that your voice, in some way, however faintly, counted. So I think a lot of those hopes have been they've certainly not been fulfilled yet across those countries, but that desire is there, and I have to believe that one day
it will be felt and somehow come to greater fruition.
Well, thank you. Let me close this with two remarks. One has to do with the notion, Sasi, you talked about this, and the Prime Minister, I think, alluded to this. I think it's extremely important when democracy is under pressure, like it is in Greece right now, for the so-called elites or those who think they're wiser than others or whatever, that they actually get off their couches and actually fight for democracy, actually go to the people, explain why it's important to protect democracy, and to actually speak the truth. It's not easy. It's very dangerous. It's very risky. It's not pleasant. But I think it's extremely important. And the worst thing you can do, in my opinion, is to ignore all this, to dismiss it as forces which are supported by the ignorant or the extremists or whatever. We all have to fight for it, and I think that's extremely important. The other thing I want to say is that 15 years ago, we started with Mr. Themis Alafouzos, Martha Dertili, Nikos Konstantaras, a joint venture with the Herald Tribune. Our wise old publisher told us that we have to become citizens of the world, that Greece needed to be much more European in its orientation, and that Greece needed to seduce the world, understand the world, and not to be afraid of it. And this joint venture was all about that. We really hope that we're going to continue this project. I know that Achilleas Chaltas and others are very committed to this. Even with the new brand, I think we're going to take this to a different level. And I want to thank Achilleas and Alberto and all the rest who put this conference together. We're looking for a window of political stability to make this happen. It was not easy, being Greece. And I also want to thank the panel for this truly global conversation and all of you for participating in this. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you. Thanks, Roger. Thank you. Sorry for mispronouncing.